and a half with us. And a big thanks to Hassan and Matt from Zorbit for leading this session with us. We certainly appreciate your support. So if you will please join with me in silence. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. God, who is more than we can ever comprehend, help us to seek you and you alone. Help us to stand before all that we could do and seek what you would do and do that. Lift from us our need to achieve all that we can be, and instead surrender to what you can be in us. Give us ways to refrain from the busyness that will put us on edge and off center, and give us today your peace. We ask this through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. And our territorial acknowledgement this morning that we would like to acknowledge that this Zoom meeting is taking place on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta and Newfoundland. Sorry, I don't know what treaty you're under out there. I should have looked that up. But thank you once again for joining us. And yeah, I'll flip it back over to Hassan and Matt.
Perfect. Thanks, Shelley, and welcome everyone. So my name is Hassan Hai. I'm with the Zorbit's Math Adventure team here in St. John's, Newfoundland, along with my colleague, Matt Murphy, who I'll turn it over to in just a moment. So just a quick sort of housekeeping items. I'll be mostly silent during this, this webinar. I'll be monitoring the chat. So for those who are maybe unfamiliar with Zoom, at the bottom of your Zoom window is a button that's called chat, and there's a little chat bubble there. For the most part, we'll be asking people to direct their questions to there, which you can pop in at any time during the session. We will be having logical pauses throughout the next about 70 minutes, so that there's plenty of time to do some interactive either answering of questions, or if you want to pop on your mic and we can take them live. But we thought to make things exciting and kind of wake everyone up, we're going to get up and do some stretches. No, that's not a real thing. Cameras are up. But what I will request everyone do, if you're comfortable, is posting in the chat one thing that you're hoping to learn today. One outcome, one thing you want to learn, one thing you want to take away from this. Whatever that is, there's no wrong answers. It's just good to understand what your expectations are so that we can sort of do a check-in to make sure that we've landed on those. So I'm not going to wait for you to do it. Just go ahead and do it. We'll get started. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Matt Murphy, who will be doing all the heavy lifting for this presentation.
All right, thanks, Hassan. Let me just get my screen share up and running here. So if someone can confirm that you're seeing Zorbit's Math Planning and Assessment.
We're good.
Awesome. So before we dive in, I just want to do a quick introduction of myself. My name is Matt Murphy. I'm one of the educational designers here at Zorbit's Math Adventure. Big part of my role here with the company is working with educators and teachers like yourselves to better understand how we use resources like Zorbit's Math in the classroom, what that looks like in terms of our implementation strategies and the impact that we can continue to make, how we can refine the product so that it makes your lives as easy as possible in the classroom and help you do what you do best, even better. And then I take all of those learnings and share them with as many teachers as I can get to listen to me. So I am a former teacher, and I've been working in education technology for the past, gosh, it's going on 8 years now. And so that's a little bit of background as to where I'm coming from. What we're going to be going over today, normally this is a little bit different from the session I would typically run. Which usually when I'm speaking with teachers in this forum, it's kind of like here's what Zorbit's Math Adventure is all about. Here's all of the bells and whistles. Here's how it works. More importantly, here's how all of the tools work together to create a blended learning experience, and kind of taking us on an in-depth tour of anything and everything Zorbit's Math. This is going to be a little bit different in that we're really zeroing in on what the assessment and lesson planning processes look like when we're using Zorbit's Math and how we can leverage some of those processes and those tools in this very challenging and new environment in which we're all operating these days. This socially distancing era has certainly presented some challenges, and when it comes to facilitating math learning in particular, and how can we extend what we would be doing in the classroom normally to at home, both in terms of the learning, but also how can we facilitate intervention? How do we get a good handle on where students are and, more importantly, what we can do about that? So we are going to start today's session with a brief tour of Zorbit's Math Adventure in case anyone is coming in cold. I shouldn't say a tour, but I guess an overview of what is this thing. Then we're going to really start this lesson planning process by setting some learning goals. And I chose that phrasing very intentionally, and I'll explain why in a few moments. Then we're going to find some resources that we can use to bring to accomplish our learning goals. And then one of the things that I've been learning a lot about in the past year or so is that it's not the resources that we use necessarily. I mean, that's a big part of it, but you can have the best gold-plated resources in the world, but if you don't do anything with them, if you don't find your teacher moves, then they can also fall flat. So we're going to see what we can do with those resources to help accomplish our learning goals. And then reflecting on what that lesson did for us, some of the assessment data that we might have been collecting or the observations that we may have made, and then what are our next steps? How can we respond to some of those observations? So those last two, reflecting and responding, is just another way of saying intervention, right? Where we're always focused on where are our students and what can we do about that. And so we're going to really dig deep into those questions and how the Zorbit's tools and the way that we implement them can help us focus on and answer those questions. Before we go any further, I have a very important question for you. This is intended to be a workshop, and because we are in a remote environment, conversations may be challenging, but I do want you guys following along, and Hassan's in the chat monitoring any questions that are coming in. But I'm going to be working through a couple of different examples, but I would love it if you guys could follow along with us on your end. And in order to do that, we first need to set that learning goal. What is it we want to teach next? Where are we in the curriculum? What are some of the objectives that we want to address that are in the K-3 math curriculum? So that as we're going through and finding these resources, hopefully you can walk out of here with a lesson plan that's ready to go for your next meetup with your kids or for your next asynchronous check-in. But before we really answer that question, that's kind of something for you to mull around in the back of your heads now as we touch on, well, what is this thing that we're looking at? What is Zorbit's Math Adventure? And for that matter, what is blended learning? Blended learning, whenever we talk about it with teachers, it's, we get many different definitions. I ask 10 different people what it means. I, without fail, get 10 different definitions. So I want to just kind of do some level setting in terms of what blended learning is. Or at least how we talk about it. And there's two things I want to highlight. One is, of course, it's the implementation of digital resources in conjunction with hands-on resources. That's kind of the blended part, right? We want to blend technology with hands-on resources, the things that we're already doing. But that phrase right there, the things that we're already doing, alludes to the other side of blended learning, is that it's not tech for tech's sake. We don't shoehorn technology into the classroom where it doesn't belong. We are firm believers in using technology with intentionality and using it to help do what you're already doing even better. I don't like some of these phrases. I haven't found better words for it, than even better or with less effort, because I don't want to say that we're going to take all of the troubles away or say like teaching shouldn't be difficult or you shouldn't put effort into it. I certainly should, but hopefully with some of these technological resources and these digital resources, ideas like personalization can come to life a little bit more easily because it becomes more scalable. Making personalized lesson plans for a classroom of 30 kids, I mean, the logistics of that are a nightmare. So that's what I mean when I say helping you do what you do best, even better, helping making some of these ideas that sound great on paper, but logistically are difficult to implement. That's what blended learning is all about. And that's the power of technology in the classroom as we see it. So Zorbit's Math Adventure is a K-3 blended learning platform. At one side, we do have these blended learning resources. It is more than just the game, although I often refer to that as our prima donna. It's the star of the show. People meet Zorbit first and they say, that's a really nice looking math game you have there. We always very graciously say, well, thank you very much. But we have hands-on resources as well. We have these hands-on games that kids can play at their desk or they can play at home. We have these exploratory ideas that they can start to develop that conceptual understanding. We have math talks. We have all of these different other tools that'll help bring not just digital learning, but blended learning to life in the classroom. But when we are talking about Zorbit's Math Adventure, the game, like I said, it's a bit of our prima donna, so I do want to give it its moment in the spotlight, but there is more to the opera than just the soloist that makes it an enriching experience. When we're playing the game, one of the things we always like to keep in mind as we're developing new activities is this idea of a math-first game design. We don't try and sugarcoat math learning. We want to position math not as an obstacle to fun bits of the game, which can actually do more harm than good in a lot of instances. If math is something that they need to get through in order to get back into the game that they were having awesome fun playing, then really what does that say about what math is? How does that position the math learning? So one of the things we really try to embrace is the idea that math is not an obstacle, math is an ally. Math is a tool that we can use to help solve problems. And so although we do have game mechanics in here like narratives, there's some badges, the star of the show is the math. We can't progress the game without engaging in math content, and it's math that becomes the fun parts of the game and not a barrier to the fun parts of the game. Recalling this idea of blended learning again, one of the things that we try and bake in here are representations or visual models that students will see in the classroom or in other learning environments. Like 10 frames, number lines, these are all models that we use every day. And so by baking those into the game and making that part of the core gameplay, by getting them to engage with that in a digital environment, it makes that transition from the game into the other things that we're doing, those hands-on exploration ideas, those, those turn and talk sort of activities that we would be doing in our classroom anyways, makes that transition a little bit easier. And they start to develop that, that developmental framework within which they can build those mathematical ideas. So we're using 10 frames, number lines, pattern blocks. I doubt you're using green peppers as base 10 or place value representations, but this idea of like part whole relationships from the hundreds to the tens to the ones is baked in here as well. And it makes for an interesting conversation when we're transitioning to those yellow base 10 blocks that we're so used to seeing, or even if we're cooking in the kitchen at home with mom and dad, this idea of part whole relationship is really interesting for students to explore. So that's Zorbit's Math Adventure, the game, some of the nuances that are baked into the activities. Of course, we also have our assessment tools in there as well. And this is something that we're going to dig into towards the later half of this session. But one of the things that I will highlight really quickly is that this is going to allow you to see quantitatively how they're doing with specific strategies. So in Charlie's example, and we'll dig in real deep on Charlie as we go on, but it really answers those two questions that I alluded to earlier about intervention is where are my students and what can I do about that? What are my next steps? So this is the part that we'll dig into later, but I just wanted to give you a quick glance as to what it looks like in the dashboard and how we tie into this third piece of this pie, our lesson planning process. We often use the phrase, data is only as useful as what you do with it, or it's only as powerful as what you do with it. So we don't just show you the data and say like, oh, your students are falling down here, here, and here. Time for you to go to work. Instead, we try and stay in your corner the entire time and say, here are some areas that we think could use some extra support. And not only that, here are some resources that we think can really support your next lesson to help close those learning gaps or help support Charlie as he moves along his numeracy development or moves along that numeracy trajectory. So all said and done, we do our best to support student learning as well as the teaching process and the lesson planning process. Oh, I forgot that there was one more slide here. Well, the way we make some of these recommendations is from our teaching activities library, and of course, some of the ways that we build scaffolding and suggested questioning techniques or recommended variations on an activity into these activities as well to make that intervention as accessible as possible. So that's our quick 5-minute tour of Zorbit's Math Adventure. That's what I would normally cover in about a half-hour PD session if we were coming in new, but I just wanted to kind of set the stage for some of the tools, the way that we like to talk about math learning and how we use our tools to bring that to life. So coming back to that question, if you would be so kind as to put into the chat, just so we're getting it out there into the world, So it's not just living in our head. What is it that you want to teach next? What are some of the concepts that you're currently focused on now with your class? And how can Zorbit's Math Adventure help bring these ideas to life in your very next lesson? We are focusing on lesson planning and assessment today, so I would love it if you were able to come out of today's session. I would consider it a huge win if we could come out with a lesson plan ready to go. Obviously, I can't do, excuse me, I can't talk apparently, but another thing I can't do is cover absolutely every possible content area in this hour we have together. So I will be working through counting on as a grade 1 addition strategy as part of our examples, as well as I'll be touching on some multiplication as an idea that is often focused on through a narrow viewpoint. I'll elaborate what I mean about that in just a moment. But this is where I'll be focusing my examples, is on counting on and multiplication, grade 1 and grade 3 respectively. Now, what I mean about, traditionally, we have, and parents certainly have a tendency to teach the way we were taught. And we know that math learning has undergone a huge paradigm shift in the last, I would say, the past 2 decades. And it's only these days that it's really starting to get some really great traction in the classroom. And I don't have it in this slide deck, but in another slide deck, I have some examples of memes that I've seen in my social media feed, where we learn all about these mathematical models that we see in hear about in the Common Core curriculum, all of these amazing exploratory ideas. These kids are about to learn how to carry the one from their homeschool teachers. And it really speaks to the idea that given when we're putting parents in the driver's seat of the at-home learning, there is going to be a tendency to focus on the way that we were taught. And that means, looking for multiplication worksheets that have droves of multiplication drills. It's that drill and kill approach. It's this focus on memorizing our times tables. Whereas we know that there's more to the puzzle, there's more to this picture of mathematical proficiency than just procedural fluency. Now, as I kind of unpack this a little bit, I do want to start by saying I do not intend to demonize procedural fluency. Those worksheets are certainly an important part of developing automaticity, and knowing our times tables, being able to recall that information at a moment's notice is certainly going to help us further on down the road. But in kindergarten to grade 3, we're not at that point yet. We're not at the point where we need to be able to recall those math facts at a moment's notice. Instead, what we know from the work of NCTM is that procedural fluency comes out of conceptual understanding. It comes out of this productive disposition, out of these other strands. These are all intertwined, and it's impossible to isolate one from the other and still employ effective math learning. So this is why earlier I mentioned this. I said that I said the phrase learning goals very specifically, not just what objectives do we want to teach. Because when we're setting a learning goal, we want to, one, know what content we're going to be teaching. And so that's one part of it. Certainly we're going to be focusing on counting on, and we're going to be focusing on multiplication as we go through these examples. But the way that we approach that is the other side of that learning goal. Where in this developmental continuum where are our students, first of all, and how can we push them along? So it's a very convoluted way of saying, like, how do we want to teach this? Do we want to teach it through drill and kill style approach, which again, I don't want to demonize it. There is a time and a place for that, but certainly not when we're introducing multiplication. But instead we want to focus, at least when we're talking about the Zorbit's resources, we tend to focus a little bit more on conceptual understanding and the frameworks, the environment in which we put these problems and these scenarios, start to develop these adaptive reasoning skills, a productive disposition, which is another way of saying that math is a worthy pursuit. It's something that should be enjoyable. So let's not view it as an obstacle. It shouldn't be a chore. It should be something that's interesting and a worthy pursuit, worthy of our time. And then out of that comes procedural fluency. So I'll show you what I mean by, kind of building from one to the next in just a moment. But another developmental framework that we like to think about is this idea of concreteness fading, or what some people call the CPA trajectory, going from concrete representations. And that can mean, tactile things we can touch and move with our hands, but it also means actual objects on screen. It doesn't necessarily mean something in our physical world, but actually using apples. If we're talking about apples into apples and oranges to oranges, let's use pictures of these things so that we can picture what they mean, what they look like in a real environment. Then we kind of fade some of that concreteness out and we start to use pictorial representations. So if we are talking tangibly, we put the apples aside and we bring out our base 10 blocks or our counters. They are still real things, but they're abstract representations of things that we just kind of put aside. And then and only then do we fade the concreteness of these ideas to the point of numerals, to the point of true abstraction. And I think particularly when we're talking about multiplication, there is a tendency for parents, because this is the way we were all taught, there is a tendency to jump straight to that abstraction and start working with numbers, where there are a million different things that could and should be happening leading up to that. So as we're going through the Zorbit's Math Adventure game, right now I'm showing a screenshot or a GIF from Aurora Farms, which is a grade 3 planet that focuses on multiplication and division. And at first glance, at first meeting of these concepts, we don't jump to that abstraction. We want to take students out of what they've already been learning. They just spent the past 2 or 3 years learning about counting and counting groups and skip counting and adding these numbers together using different anchors, anchors of 5, anchors of 10, using doubling strategies. These are all things that they've encountered in previous years. And we're going to leverage that experience. We're going to leverage that additive reasoning to show that if we keep adding, if we do repeated addition, then we can construct these numbers using that strategy. We don't need to jump right into multiplication. So we're kind of setting the stage here in terms of, leveraging where students are and pushing them through this trajectory to learn something new. As we start to see success with this, there's going to be other other visual representations that we can introduce, like area models or arrays, as they're also called. So another activity is going to get students not to select which is an array of 15, but rather they're going to have to actively construct an array of 15. So if this is our goal, if we want students to develop their multiplicative reasoning, one of the ways that we can do that, one of the ways that we can facilitate that transition is by giving these visual models and not just showing them and demonstrating them, but getting them to actively construct them themselves. And eventually they'll start to get the idea that, this is 5 by 3, and anytime I need to make 15, I can do that by drawing a rectangle that has 5 across the top and 3 along the side, or vice versa, 3 along the top, 5 across the bottom, across the side. In this instance, we wouldn't be able to do that one. But as the game progresses, as the game recognizes proficiency with this idea and starts to recognize like, hey, I think this kid knows how to construct an array. I think he's getting what's going on here with this sort of scenario. We're going to start putting it into a more, into a thicker problem-solving environment where now we need to employ some critical thinking. So this is that idea of adaptive reasoning and building that productive disposition, because we're going to take something they just encountered and make it a little bit more interesting. So what's really great about these types of activities, and again, if I, tooting our own Zorbit's horn here a little bit, if I do say so myself, one of the things that makes these activities really great is the way that it offers student agency. We know that students are coming to the table with any level of, any combination of experiences. One thing we know for sure is that no two students are alike. So giving them the opportunity to explore a solution, to explore a plan, to develop a plan and explore that idea in their own way, on their own terms, is going to create that productive disposition more than just following an algorithmic approach by saying like, this is step 1, this is step 2, oh, you messed up on step 3, so let's really unpack that. Instead, we're going to let students to explore these ideas and answer the problems in a way that makes sense for them. So even though the strategy here is relatively straightforward, there's not a lot of divergence there, but the way that they engage with this problem, the way that they solve this problem is going to be different, or the possible ways that they can construct an answer is quite numerous. So they can really start to express their student voice and their own problem-solving agency. And then finally, we'll get them to that point of procedural fluency. We'll fade that abstraction, or excuse me, we'll fade that concreteness to the point of abstraction, where now we are focused on those multiplication math facts. But again, we're doing it in a very playful manner, right? We're keeping it in this environment where, in order for us to launch these weedlies up into the trees where they can finish their harvest, we need to fix this machine, and we fix this machine by closing the circuits in a way that the equations make sense. So at its core, we are practicing those math facts, but it's a lot more fun for students if they can do it within a gaming environment in which they've already kind of gone through some of that, some of those prerequisite models. Focusing on counting on, switching to our other example, even in kindergarten, we're doing this same sort of idea where we're going to get students counting, and you'll notice this idea of concreteness fading is being used here as well. We don't just jump to numerals. We're using these models like 10 frames. And in this particular example, we can even use some spatial reasoning to start, making some best guesses as to what comes next. If the pipe is up in the top left here, or is, entering this box at the top left, probably not going to be this one here as our next one. So it is a kind of a workaround for students, but it gives them another way to engage with this or to enter this activity. And through that, they'll start to develop that counting on idea and see that visual model, which will then facilitate this understanding of anchors of 5, which is the beauty of 10 frames. And eventually we'll start working with numerals. And eventually, I don't think I have a screenshot of it here, these pipes start to turn into bundles of pipes so that spatial reasoning piece is removed. And so they need to focus specifically on the concept at hand. Then they'll start to be dealing with counting on as a strategy for addition. How do we compose a number how do we compose 8 if we already have 5? Well, we could start counting at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then figure out what we got to do next. But eventually students will start to see that 5 is already here, 6, 7, 8, it looks like there's 3 there. And so they start to use this strategy that moves beyond what Lawson calls counting 3 times, which is probably the first thing that students do when they start adding. It's like one step beyond subitizing in cardinality. Eventually, when we get into grade 1, we'll start using that number line, and we will start developing that procedural fluency where we are asking them within a context to select a solution as opposed to constructing their counting strategies as before. So this is where we take that those conceptual understanding ideas, that productive disposition, all of those different strands, and then we start to leverage that idea of procedural fluency. So these are a couple of examples of activities that you can find in the Zorbit's Math Adventure universe, and it's quite a large expanse. It's quite a universe to explore. So the question I'm sure you're all asking yourself is, all of this sounds great, but how on earth do I find the activities that I want to accomplish my learning goals? And this is where I'm going to jump into my teacher dashboard. We're going to go through the process of how do we find it? How do I vet it? How do I test out what it is that I'm going to ask or present to my students? And then how do I point them in the right direction? How do I get these activities in front of them? Before I do, I just did a ton of nerding out on conceptual understanding and some of these some of these strands of mathematical proficiency as they pertain to the activities in our digital resources in particular. Hassan, do we have any questions coming in there now that I can take a moment and answer?
My goodness, that we have pages and pages and pages of questions. Let's see here. So there's things related to assessment and evaluation, which I think we'll just save for that logical section when we get to that piece. There was some questions in the chat about sort of getting started. So I did paste in the chat for those who aren't looking. If you haven't already set up your classroom, your students, or sent home parent letters to families, I did paste in the chat links to 2 really easy to follow support articles on that initial getting started piece. Let's see here. How can we invite the times? Let's see here. Sorry, I'm just reading my own notes now. So there were some questions. Actually, one was, can we use Zorbits for students with special needs?
I mean, absolutely. As long as the resources are developmentally appropriate for the students with the special needs that you're targeting, I would say, yes, we see this used all the time. As a matter of fact, I had the great pleasure of visiting Calgary Catholic a year, 2 years ago, gosh, it seemed like yesterday, where I had the pleasure of seeing Students, I believe, at the high school level with special needs, using it as a way to immerse themselves with numeracy. So I mean, if if it seems like it's a good fit, certainly we love to see this making as much of an impact wherever it can possibly have that impact as possible.
Alicia O'Brien had just mentioned that she's using Zorbits with a special needs class. So if anyone is curious and they themselves are looking, maybe you can lead on Alicia for some insights on how it's been working for her.
One thing whenever I get that question, it's the first time that I think it's been asked in that way, and usually it alludes to a point that I think I'm glossing over in this presentation, is that when you log into the game, students don't see labels like kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. Instead, they'll see the name of the kindergarten area is Alfabulous. So they are kind of labeled with a wink and a nod to the sequential nature, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. But they don't see kindergarten. So the example I often use is if you have a grade 2 student who needs that remedial support, who needs those foundational skills bolstered, you can personalize the access and send them to the kindergarten area, but they don't get that kick in the pants that seeing the word kindergarten slapped across the screen might induce, right? They don't feel like they're less than their peers or operating under where they should be. I know at a young age, knowing that you're operating below like grade 2, seeing grade kindergarten level activities, that's going to foster that idea that, oh, I mustn't be a math person. And that's an idea that's plagued the math community for far too long. So we try to remove those labels and remove that idea by making it easier for teachers to differentiate instruction or differentiate access in the game without them seeing those labels. The student will never know that they're exploring kindergarten level activities unless, of course, you tell them. So we'll show you how you can personalize the in-game access in a moment. That's kind of step 3. How do I point the students at it?
I think there's a few others now, but I think they're probably better answered a bit later in the session. So,
Sure.
but if anyone else, just a reminder, we have some people who are active in the chat. Feel free to pop your questions in there. Don't be shy. Whatever we don't get to during the session, we'll make sure that we circle back with Shelley and make sure that the questions are fully answered.
All right, so I'm in my dashboard here now. This is where I'm going to do some of my lesson planning and kind of get my bearings when it comes to the wild universe, the wide universe of Zorbit's Math Adventure. We are currently working on what we are calling internally our game guide, which is going to make what I'm about to show you a little bit more streamlined and intuitive. But in the interim, the way that we've learned from teachers that they find these resources inside the dashboard, there's a couple of steps. So after I have my classroom set up and I have my students' accounts created and I have their parent letters gone home, all of which is, this is all part of the setup that we're kind of skipping over here today. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. We'll follow up with you afterwards. We're jumping in assuming everything is already set up. And I'm looking for counting on, for example. The best place for me to start looking for these different ideas and what's available in the game is in my class progress area. So under game, we're going to see progress. And this is where I'm collecting all of the student performance data. Now, bear in mind that this is my sandbox account. There are very few, if any, students playing the games through these accounts, and which is why mine is very kind of lackluster in terms of its color. Yours is going to be much more colorful than mine, but we're going to talk about those colors in a little bit. What I really want to highlight is the way that the content or the data is organized. So if I'm looking at counting on, for example, what I can do is I can look at these different headings and see, well, there's different strands here. I can see operations, geometry, number sense, and so on. And underneath each of these strands, I can see different general learning outcomes like subtraction, addition, or mental math. And a feature that not a lot of people realized at first glance is that these dots here are clickable. Not only does it offer really great insights as to how a student is doing and what they're doing in the game, but even if there's no data, what it can do is give you an idea as to what sort of game modules are present inside Zorbit's Math Adventure. So if I can't find what I'm looking for, like counting on, for example, sounds like it would be under number sense. Let's see counting groups. You can see anchors of 10, dice, 10 frames, anchors of 5. There's some interesting ideas in here, but it's not exactly what I'm looking for. Addition, counting on is an addition strategy. 1 digit, 2 digit, place value, still not quite right. As I click around, I'll start to find, it's like, counting on. There it is there. It's under the idea of mental math, which makes sense because when we're using that strategy, we are employing mental math. We're trying to develop that conceptual understanding so that we can develop that procedural fluency. One of the strategies that we'll use is counting on. So this is where I'll find it. Now, backing up just a moment. This is where I'm hoping you're able to follow along with me. Like I said, we're working on a more streamlined process. Once I found this, I note what strand it's under. It's under the operations strand. If I come into my game controls, I wonder now what planet is that on? Because the different solar system, the different constellations represent different grades. The different planets represent different strands. So if I'm looking for a grade 1 operations area, well, that's the spaceport. So I'm going to find counting on at the spaceport, which is the operations planet in the grade 1 area. So I've found it. That's where it is. Now I need to vet it. How can I see what are some of the activities that students are going to engage with when we're playing that game? So one thing I can do, and this is kind of an aside, this is a best practice, I can add myself as a student to the classroom so that I have my own student login information. And this is how I can check any assignments that I create, which we'll touch on them in a moment, and see any game controls that I've configured. Again, we're going to get there in just a moment. But as a tip, I typically tell teachers, add yourself as a student to your class so you can go into the game and see exactly what students are seeing. But we also have this play button here, which brings us to our teacher sandbox. So this is a fully unlocked version of the game, which will allow you to jump to any planet, any game, any activity at any time. So as this loads up here, we'll see that even though my game controls are configured so that I shouldn't be able to see everything, in this sandbox, everything is available. So I remember it was the grade. Oh, and I'm in French here. So that's a nice little plug for the fact that this is all in French immersion as well. The Beta Momax system, and I'm going to try to pronounce French because I'm going to make so many people's ears bleed if I try and do that. And we find that planet. Where is the operations planet? I think it's this one here. The Port Spatial. There it is. Now everyone's cringing at my terrible French pronunciation. So there's the spaceport, the planet where I'm told from the class progress area I would find counting on. I'll skip over the little fun back and forth between M, the spaceport manager. And on the surface of the planet, we'll see these different nodes. So right now I'm in the mental math area, and I can see some of those ideas that we saw in the class progress area a moment ago. I can see compose 5. I can see doubling. I can see all of these concepts that were in those, that concept module that we saw. And I wonder now, am I going to recognize it when I see it in French? Counting on. I think translation is throwing me for a loop here. But at any rate, when you come in here, this is where you'll find those modules and you can find the concept. If I had this in English, you'd see that they align directly with the headings that we saw in the problem. So we've found it in our progress area by finding it under here, found counting on, compose 10, compose 5, some of those we saw. And we can vet it by playing it here. And we can go in and actually click around and play some of those activities ourselves. And then the last thing is, how do I make sure students are pointed in the right direction? So this is where we're starting to get into this idea of, forming our lesson plan. We do that, first of all, by configuring our game controls. When you create a classroom, the first thing that you're going to be asked, or one of the first things you're going to be asked is, what grade are you teaching? And by telling it grade 1, what that does is it turns off the kindergarten area, it turns off grade 2, and it turns off grade 3. So by default, assuming you've selected grade 1 when you created the classroom, this is what you're going to see. The entire grade 1 area is currently available. Let's say I really want to focus them on that concept. I'm going to turn off some of the other planets. So now when a student logs into the game, they'll only see the grade 1 area. And when they log into that area, the only planet they're going to have access to is the operations. But I know that there are students that are still early on in their counting on strategy, They're still early in their numeracy development. So I'm going to personalize this access. I'm going to make it unavailable to Charlie, Anna, and Lavin. And instead, I'm going to send them back to the kindergarten area where they're going to see some of those same ideas that we demonstrated a moment ago. Again, if I wanted to vet the activities that I'm sending Charlie, Anna, and Lavin towards, then I can check it in the class progress area. Let's check kindergarten. We got compose 5, compose 10, number sense, counting groups, counting forwards. There's our counting on strategy right there. So when I get into the number sense area, which is the planet of Nonamia, we can start vetting those activities through our sandbox. So like I said, it's unfortunately right now, it's not the most intuitive process, but if we know where we're looking, then we can connect some of these dots as to, here are the concepts that are available in the game. Let's go find those activities in the game and play them and test them out and see how they fit. And then we'll use our game controls to help configure the access so that students are pointed in the right direction so that they find those activities. We are, like I said, we're currently working on a game guide that's going to make that alignment, connect those dots a little bit more intuitively. Currently, this is the way that we see a lot of teachers doing it. And after you've done it 2 or 3 times, it becomes a lot more intuitive in terms of, you start to be able to navigate the Zorbit's universe a little bit more naturally with that familiarity. One last thing I'm going to show you before I get back into my slides are these assignments. So this is where we can really send students on very specific missions. We can drill down on those specific concepts more so than just sending them to the right planet. Here we can pick specifically the counting on strategy. So I'm going to create a new assignment. We're going to say counting on is the name of it. Choose a grade. Well, I'm working in the grade 1 context right now. And I remember it was on the spaceport or the operations plan. Next, I want to add my content. And this is where you're going to see a lot of that familiar language that we've seen. We've seen when we clicked on the addition dot, we saw 1-digit, 2-digit place value additions. And when we got down to mental math, this is where we started to see those strategies. So counting on is right there. And you know what, just for good measure, let's put in compose 5, just so we can build on maybe something we did last week. So we'll do 2 activities of that and 4 activities on counting on. As I'm creating this, I can add up to 10. It won't let you add any more than 10, but I wouldn't typically recommend as many as 10 anyways. I can see that the time is adjusting up here. It's going to take students about 35 minutes to complete this activity. So when I'm happy with what I've selected, I can move on and assign these to the appropriate students, remembering that Charlie, Anna, and Lavin, they're seeing different content. So I'm going to make another assignment for them when I'm done making this one so that I can differentiate that access. I'm not going to actually make it here live on screen, but that's the plan. That's part of my lesson plan process. And when I hit next, I'm asked to give it a time frame. Let's assign it this week, but you know what? I want to give them, it's a short week. Let's give them until next week to do this assignment. When I'm finished, there it is, ready to go. I've assigned it to 23 students out of the 26 that are in my class, including myself. I've assigned it to myself so that when I log into the game using my own student credentials, I can see that assignment as well, and I'll see exactly what the students see. So in terms of some guiding best practices, one of the things that we see teachers doing is creating these as like a weekly assignment. So giving students, sending home the expectation that, every week there's going to be something new in the game for your kids. So, get in there every once in a while and see what's new. It gives them an excuse to keep checking back for something new as opposed to just exploring without any, real guidance. That can get pretty stale pretty quick if they're just, exploring at their leisure. But if they know that there's something specifically handcrafted for them from their teacher, then they can, it's more enticing to go back into the game. So when we're guiding that in-game experience, we want to set those game controls, and we can create these assignments. And when we do that, here's what students are going to see. They're going to see limited access to the areas that you've made available to them. So they'll see only the grades that you've opened for them or have unlocked. They'll see the planets that you've unlocked for them. I often tell kids that this it's nighttime on these dark planets, and Zorbit can't land safely in the dark. And then when you've created an assignment, they can still explore those planets, right? They still have full freedom to go explore at their leisure to anything that you've made available. But on top of that, they're also going to get a little alert up here in their backpack, this button that's kind of ever present in the game. And this is a direct route to any adventures. We call them adventures in the game because students don't like that word assignments. Any adventures that you've crafted for them. So that's where they can get into those specific weekly missions. We've even seen teachers create custom daily missions, which, if you're doing this, the best thing I would recommend is just, have one activity, 10 minutes tops, right? There's a lot of literature that suggests 15 to 20 minutes 3 times a week is that sweet spot for digital learning. Now that's in when we're dealing in class, in a classroom environment. So it's a little bit different when we're dealing remotely. So, I mean, this is a neat idea that if you want to guide it day by day, but knowing that students and families are dealing with a lot right now, daily may not be the best approach. But of course, every class is different. But a weekly assignment is something that they can pick away at their leisure throughout the week. And this is what it looks like when they show up in the game.
Matt?
Yes.
Just to jump in there, just a quick time checks. We're about 25 minutes from the end of our scheduled time. But also Lena had a question about specific to assignments, and not about the structure of it, but is there a way to encourage kids to do their backpack assignments besides closing off the planets through game controls? So we're looking for a pro tip on this.
Yeah, so I mean, that would be my first pro tip, is that if you want them specifically engaged with those assignments, shut everything else down. Get into the game controls and toggle everything else off. It will not limit their ability to engage with the assignments that you've created. And so that would be, I guess, the first pro tip. The other one, of course, would just be maintaining communication and setting that expectation with families and say, like, hey, this is something I'm doing. It's part of the way that we're continuing the math learning, the way that we're going to continue to keep tabs on how students are doing with various contexts or concepts. It's how we're going to make decisions on what we're going to do next and how we can better support your kids with their math learning. Because as they complete these activities, there's a lot of really great data that's being collected. So this is one example that I did actually have the luxury of having some data collected for examples. And I can see, again, Charlie is, struggling with these ideas, or at least is not using the intended strategy. He might be counting on his fingers. He may be using something else that's allowing him to make progress, but he's not using the intended strategy. He's not, I guess, operating optimally, for lack of a better phrase, in this environment. So sending home that communication and setting those expectations is a great way to encourage participation in these sorts of activities. And this is something that I'm glad we can start alluding to it now for the sake of time. This data that's being collected, I wouldn't slap these numbers on a report card. Zorbit's Math Adventure is not intended to be a summative assessment tool per se, but it's really great for formative assessment in that we can really dig into where students are today and what we can do about that tomorrow, as opposed to getting a full picture as to what their year's worth of work has become. So hopefully that answered the question.
We got an LOL, that's what I thought, from Lena, so I think she's happy with the answer.
Okay, great.
Or been validated.
Okay, awesome. All right. So I guess for the interest of time, there's a few other little points that I wanted to talk about as we go through. I guess we'll keep on going, will we?
Yeah, there are some other questions, but I think we can save those. Some of them are a bit outliers, where it's only one person who's asked. So I may look for some questions that have been asked more than once to try and use the time that we have left.
Sure.
Yeah, and actually those questions were actually the outcomes people wanted at the beginning. So they may not in fact be questions. They may be answered just through the presentation.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, so we've done a lot of talking about the digital resource and how we can get students pointed in the right direction because, like I said, the Zorbit's universe is a vast expanse covering curriculum outcomes from kindergarten to grade 3. It's how we can find it, vet it, and point students at it using some of the tools in the dashboard. Of course, when we're talking about blended learning, we also talk about getting our hands messy with the math, getting our hands, these hands-on activities. It's not just all digital. So our teaching activities library is full of these types of resources, and they are not worksheets, right? They are not those drill and kill style multiplication worksheets that I talked about earlier. These are intended to be very playful, very social, to encourage active participation in their learning, to develop that conceptual understanding through exploration and through play. So there's over 200 activities in here. How do we find the ones that we want to send home that align with our current learning goals? So again, this progress area is really kind of our jump off point for all of those things. If I know I'm dealing with counting on, well, you may notice my cursor changing shape here as I hover over it. I can use these links, and what it's going to do, it's going to bring me into my teaching activities library with some of these filters pre-populated. So I can do this manually. I can go through these filters myself manually, but by going through the class progress area, I can get some of those recommendations directly. We added this one recently, select a tag, and what tags we've been using is home learning. So these are ones that are particularly conducive for attaching to an email to parents and say, hey, here's some ideas for you to play with your kids this week. Or remote teaching, things that are great for your weekly check-ins. As I understand it, there's an expectation for teachers to meet with their class at least once a week. So these are the types of activities that are really great for that. And one of the things that you're going to find pop up here are these math talks. And I'm going to jump into those in just a second. I do want to make sure that I'm not jumping the gun here on any of my slides. Let me backtrack for just a second. These activities, like I said, they are activities that are intended to be very playful, very social. They employ design thinking. One of my favorites is addition on a number line, where basically students roll the dice and they themselves move along a giant number line or number path that they put on the floor. The only rule I ever employ is that you can't walk. You've got to dance, skip, hop, do anything other than walk along that number line. And in essence, what we're doing is practicing procedural fluency with addition. We're rolling the dice, seeing what numbers come up and adding it. But we're doing it with a number line, a model that we're intimately familiar with in the grade 1 classroom. We're also being very kinesthetic, right? We're up and we're being very active and very playful. So these are wonderful activities for kids to play at home, and the way that they're designed is to provide parents with some ideas as to what they can do to help, fill the role or fill the shoes of the teacher in terms of asking the right questions, knowing what to look for. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, what we do with these resources is really what makes them sing. It's not just, giving them the game, giving them these activities, but, ensuring that we're using them with intent. So something I'm going to glaze over even more so than I had intended to for the interest of time. Perhaps I'll save this for when hopefully we're back in the classroom in September. Some classroom implementation strategies like facilitating teacher intervention or individual practice, which is, probably the scenario that we're going to find ourselves in anyways if they're playing at home. We also see these activities, both digital and hands-on, playing really well together as a center-based learning. But one of the things I just alluded to, and I'm going to resist the temptation to nerd out too hard, because I could talk for hours on math talks, because they're one of my favorites. And the reason why they're one of my favorites is because they are fantastic for formative assessment, which really these days ought to be our real focus. This idea of intervention focusing on where are my students and what can I do about that really hits at the heart, or is, runs in parallel with this idea of formative assessment. So this is one of my favorite analogies when I'm talking about assessment. It breaks down when you start to think about what that soup represents. It's the student learning. It's certainly not something that's perishable or consumable. But what I like about this is that formative assessment gives chefs the ability to, there's still time. We can still change the outcome of this soup. We can make it better. We can taste it and add a little salt. We can check in with our students and give them a different activity or give them a different, something to do that'll help facilitate their progression. And so formative assessment is something that we are always thinking about. But how do we do that digitally? How do we taste digital soup?
Like I said, I understand that you guys have the luxury of being able to, perhaps luxury isn't the right word, but I dare not opine too much, of meeting with your kids once a week. One of the ways that I would love to, or one of the recommendations, let me start over. One of the great benefits of doing a math talk is that it brings formative assessments to life. And this is a great way to kick off one of these live sessions. When I'm watching my daughter participate in her live sessions, a lot of it is just checking, mental health and making sure that, everything's going okay. We're going to meet our peers and talk to them a little bit. But, as part of that conversation, let's talk about something that has a bit of mathematical meat on the bones. And these math talks are a great way to do that, to help make that time a little bit more productive, but also give us that formative assessment data, those observations that we're missing from the classroom. The answer is not the point, right? So we're talking about looking at these dots and the question being, how many dots? The answer is 9, and nobody cares about the answer. What we're really concerned about is how did they count it? So when the student raises their hand and says, I see 9, say, well, how do you see that 9? And the answers that they give is really going to give you some insight as to what strategies they're using, how well they can subitize. Are they using just early foundational strategies like cardinality? Are they counting one at a time like Ali here? Or are they seeing equal groups here? Are they adding those equal groups and starting to think about multiplicative reasoning? Maybe they're like LeBron here and they're going to be business moguls as they start to already think about supply chain optimization as they take inventory of the different colors that are here. Christine, on the other hand, is subitizing. She sees this shape up top, which is very familiar, and knows that's 6, and then 3 more down below. Well, 6 and 3 is 9. So the way that they answer that question, how do you see it or how do you know, is really where that formative assessment comes to light. A lot of teachers are who are new to math talks see it as a bit of either it's a kind of a pie in the sky idea where we're just talking about math in a very ethereal space or in a very ethereal way until we start to see some of these ideas come to light. And so for anyone who's uncomfortable with it or is kind of skeptical or wondering, how do I break the ice for myself with math talks? Which one doesn't belong is a really great entry point, because these have often been described as very safe sorts of math talks. In that, basically everyone can have an opinion as to which one doesn't belong, and more importantly, come up with a reason as to why it doesn't belong. One of the things we started doing to bring math talks and 3-act math tasks to life in a asynchronous environment are these mathematics videos where we had Kyle Pierce join us for this particular one, where we had a couple of different examples and asked the audience, which one doesn't belong. And so when you're live with your kids, you can pull up some of these visuals that are available in your teacher dashboard. So we've got all of our math talks here and you can search for them, or grab a couple of objects around the house and ask the kids which one doesn't belong. And more importantly, why do you think that? If no one is saying this red ball, why not pose the question, is there a reason why this red ball mightn't belong? And start thinking more critically in that respect. And so that's one of 4 videos that we created under this guise of mathematics in the house. And like I said, these are intended to be demonstrations of what a 3-act math task could potentially look like, or what number talks can look like, even in a synchronous environment. So one of the ways that I've seen teachers use these videos is to basically say to parents and families, say, give this video a watch, pause the video when it says to pause it, follow along, answer some of the questions, get some things that you can start manipulating and follow along with. And when we come back, we're going to talk about it, right? We're going to talk about, how did you make 24? What did you think that was interesting about the number 4 or the number 100? How many pieces of popcorn were in your bowl of popcorn, and how did you count? How was your strategy different from the one that was shown in the video? Or how was it similar? So I'd encourage you to check that out. And all of our resources that we for these home learning kits are available here on your class homepage. You won't see Math Game Changers. This is the name of my class. You'll see whatever you called it. But there's a card here that says home learning kits. And this will bring you to a landing page where all of those videos, all of our Zorbit's daily challenges are posted, any of the hands-on activities that we've designed specifically for home learning. They're all right there.
Perfect.
Finally, The last thing that I want to cover here today before we open it up for questions is what happens after the lesson. So we've crafted that lesson, we've configured our game controls so students are pointed in the right direction in the digital resource. We've even created an assignment that focuses specifically on the math concepts that we want them to focus on. And we've vetted them to make sure that they're focused on not necessarily procedural fluency, but that there is more conceptual understanding ideas in there as well. Then we've also looked for some hands-on activities, and whether through Google Classroom or through an email, we've sent these things home with some recommendations as to what parents can do to help engage their kids with these activities. As we've seen, there's some key questions on those for teachers or for parents to ask along the way. But all the while, what happens after this? So how do we look at that formative assessment data? And how do we find it, first of all? So in our dashboard, and I'm not going to jump back into my dashboard here because my data is a lot less colorful than some of these screenshots. But when you arrive on your class homepage, one of the first things we're going to show you is some of the learning gaps that we're beginning to identify based on their in-game participation. We're going to show you in a moment how to dig a little bit deeper, but the other side of that intervention coin is what can we do about that? So right here on your homepage, we're going to try and make some recommendations as to some of the activities that are in that library that we think will help facilitate or help address some of these areas of concern. Well, let's dig a bit deeper into this data. Like I said, this is intended to be formative assessment data. So ideally, you'll start to see these colors turn green, these reds and yellows turn green as students start to employ some of the more, I guess, for lack of a better word, some of the intended strategies that are baked into the activities. They will see success, they will complete the activities using their own strategies and exploring. But the way that this data is compiled is much like any sort of puzzling game, or you do a puzzle or a Sudoku or like Candy Crush, and at the end of it, once you've finished it, it'll give you like that 3-star rating. And if you've gotten 3 stars, you've probably solved the puzzle in the quote most optimal way, right? You've done it in the fewest moves. So that's what I mean about the intended strategy. If you use the counting on strategy or use the area models or the arrays in the way that that's considered to be the most efficient route to a solution, then you're going to see the green show up here, and that indicates that the student is using that strategy and experiencing some success with that strategy. Red doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely lost. Red means that they are still probably seeing some level of success, but they're using a strategy that may not be as efficient or as direct as the intended strategy. Again, I'm using all of these terms, intended, efficiency, very loosely, knowing that students are going to solve a problem the way that works for them. But what this tells me is that Charlie, he's either struggling across the board or he's using a couple of strategies that are early on in the development. And as we move through this progression, as we move into more concepts and in grade 2 and grade 3, he may start to really struggle because those strategies don't scale. So the trends that we can see here for individual students will allow us to see where Charlie is on that trajectory, but we'll also be able to see across the board here, well, this is a really interesting situation here when we're talking about addition, because some students are really getting it, they're using those intended strategies. Other students are not quite there, they need some support. We've got what we call a learning gap here, or a wide range of abilities. Well, let's dig in even deeper. When we click on Charlie's dot, I mentioned earlier that we can get this concept report. Here I can see Charlie addition to 10, no problem. He's operating pretty optimally. Again, take these words with a grain of salt. But when it comes to addition to 20, he's struggling a bit, right? So whatever strategy he's using is not scaling. Maybe he's counting on his fingers. Maybe he has his math facts memorized. Whatever the case is, knowing where that student is and knowing what strategies he may or may not be using is going to help inform what we do next. So clicking on this button or any of these links up here are going to bring us into that teaching activities library to help inform what we do next in our next lesson, what we send home in our next email. And something that I think I kept alluding to, but I don't think I explicitly demonstrated it yet, was that these lesson plans or these activities in the teaching activities library come with these key questions that we would encourage parents to ask as they're engaged with these activities. And this is going to help illuminate what's going on inside the students' brains. And then based on that, are they struggling? Well, here's some recommendations. Are they really getting this and need further enrichment? Well, here's some recommendations. And so parents can use these. Of course, you can use them as well when we get back into the classroom or when we're making direct contact with parents. Another way we can respond is by refining that in-game experience, right? We already guided it when we set up students to get started into the game. But as that data starts to roll in, we start to recognize that Charlie, he's struggling in grade 1. Knowing that kind of triggers me or helps me make the decision that maybe I want to send him back to the kindergarten activities. Or maybe I want to differentiate those assignments a little bit more. Maybe I want to create 3 different assignments, one for those who are operating at grade level, above, below grade level, so that we're keeping everyone productively engaged. So that's it. Sorry for speeding up there a little bit at the end. I tend to get a little bit carried away when it comes to talking about some of the conceptual understanding or some of the underpinning frameworks. I tend to get really excited and nerd out real hard on them. So hopefully I didn't go too fast there towards the end as we really started to dig in on that data, what it means and how we can use it. And I would just want to reiterate that, that data is very much intended for formative assessment. It would be, I wouldn't recommend taking that data and saying, here's your report card, because it's intended just to be a snapshot of where they are today. And a red dot does not necessarily mean that they are falling down or that they don't understand. It just means that there is room for, again, I'm using all the wrong words here, room for improvement in terms of the strategies that we're using. Yeah. So we talked about what Zorbits is, the whole suite of tools and resources. We looked at, we set our own learning goals, both in terms of the objectives that we wanted to cover and how we wanted to address them. Based on those goals, we looked into our dashboard and poked around and found the right resources. We coupled them with our own teacher moves, whether it be a math talk or sending home various recommendations. And of course, one of those math moves is always going to be, or one of those teacher moves is always going to be looking at that data, facilitating formative assessment, and then making decisions on what we do next. So with that, I will hand over to Hassan and any questions that may have come in. And I apologize for not leaving much time. I can stick around for as long as we need to. I do want to be respectful of your guys' time as well.
Great. So actually, we were having a very lively chat. In fact, we almost wanted to turn the video off and just chat over there. A lot of people loving the math talks, a lot of conversation around that, and that's great to hear. There was a little bit of chatter about Google Classroom, and it was kind of answered within the chat as well. There's some questions from some people on how can I integrate this with Google Classroom, and if I understood the question correctly, I think it was more to link the resource. And so forgive me if I have the name wrong. I think Lena may have indicated how she was using Google Classroom. So we, of course, we're not directly linked to Google Classroom, but of course you can take the links, the URLs for the Play website, any of the at-home activities. If anyone's curious about copyright stuff, we just ask that you cut us in for half. I'm just kidding. So as long as you're not sharing it publicly or publishing it, you are welcome to share any of the teaching activity resources with your families, with your students through your Google Classroom, sending them home. We have no issues at all there. So any other questions as far as from the group? I know most of them were discussion items rather than actual questions. So we have a few minutes left. Certainly we're not in a rush, but we want to be respectful of your time. Whatever we can't answer in this call, please place it in the chat. Whatever we can't get to, we will be happy to circle back with Shelley, and then she can distribute the answers to everyone. Let's see here. Nothing in yet. Any recipes to share? Any baking tips? Not yet. There's a question from Alicia. Is there a way to communicate with the kids through the platform?
No, not at the moment. I guess the closest thing we have would be to the game controls, in that we're configuring and can personalize it there. We can deliver those assignments on an individual or group basis. In terms of communicating login access from the class roster, we have our parent letters, which gives a bit of context to parents as to what it is and their individual login information for their kids.
Sure.
There's no like chat or email. It's not intended to be a holistic learning management system like Brightspace or Google Classroom. It is a math learning blended learning platform specifically. So no contact with or communication.
Alicia followed up on her question saying, like giving them stars or points. So if I'm getting this correctly, it's more like engaging them rather than actual direct communication.
Oh, okay. So that's an interesting question. It's not something we currently have in there. As they progress in the game, they do earn stars and they do earn badges and various things like that. But one of the first things we talked about was this idea of a math-first game design. So we try and take a very light touch with that sort of stuff. Some of the criticisms we've heard about tools that I won't name any names, but it's very easy for kids to just spend all their time customizing their avatar, or to go shopping using their in-game currency and really do very little math. We do recognize that there is a place for those sorts of mechanics in terms of engagement, but we didn't want them to steal the show from the math concepts. So we used a very light touch when it came to those mechanics. Those mechanics, although they are not teacher facilitated, we can't really assign or revoke badges, but all of those things that the student earns within the game is available in their backpack. So the same way that they access the assignments, there's a couple of little tabs there where they can monitor or keep track of their own progress through those badges.
Perfect. We were at time. I just wanted to speak to one question that came up a few times regarding parent letters and inviting parents to classrooms, whether you could do it like broadly by sending a link out, or do you have to send individual ones? Matt, if you're okay, I can just go ahead and answer that question as well.
Yeah, sure.
So there's a couple ways that you can invite parents or students to the platform. Unfortunately, today you can't send one link that will work for everyone. So you would need to today generate individual parent letters. And I can share with Shelley, who can share that broadly with everyone. There's two resources as far as getting started. Matt's showing it on screen right now, is that when you're on the student roster page, there's the big button will download one file which has all the parent letters. That's suited to a classroom where you can hand it out so they can go home. However, if you click on the three buttons there and download an individual parent letter, each file will be labeled after the student's name, and that's suitable for either emailing directly to the parents or on Google Classroom. If there's a private space for each student, you could place it in there as well. I don't know well enough to know that if there is a place for Sally's letter to be exclusive to Sally or not, but if that were the case, you could upload it to Sally's Google Classroom space. Okay, that might be it for what we can answer online. I'm going to recommend you can do one of two things. For any questions that we haven't answered, certainly repost them in the chat, or if you're comfortable, share it with Shelley, and Shelley can give all those questions to us. We may not be able to connect who asked the question with the answer, but what we would ideally like to do is answer all of them and then share that with Shelley, which we'll of course get to. If one person is asking, presumably 20 others are probably thinking the same thing. So we'd rather answer it as broadly as we can. There was one last thing as far as how to get in touch with us. Matt, I think you have the slide up right now. Matt's contact info is there. Support is the best way to broadly reach us. So that someone had asked, how do you report bugs? Well, we'd like to say everything's perfect and you'll never experience that, but there's always some glitches. There's things that we find out and you're the ones using it. Sometimes we find odd things based on user feedback. So please send that our way. Myself and my colleague Shane are typically the ones replying to our teacher friends through our support inbox. So please reach out to us there and we'll be happy to get in touch with you. And if it's a bug, we'll get it fixed. Perfect. So this session, for those who were asking, has been recorded. We'll end the recording in a second. Probably within no more than 24 hours from now, we'll have it shared with Shelley, along with some other follow-up items that we promised. And anyone who missed pieces of it, or if your audio was cutting out, you had to drop offline, you'll be able to see it in its entirety. Great.
Just on behalf of Calgary Catholic, thank you, Hassan and Matt, for spending time this morning with us and showing us all the ins and outs of Zorbit. It was a phenomenal session, very practical, very timely as we move towards progress reports and whatnot, so we can really maximize the resource. And just a huge thank you to everyone who joined us this morning as well from Calgary Catholic. We sure appreciate you spending your time with us. And like Hassan said, I will send out all of the information that they both referred to as soon as I get it. And if you have any questions, you've got my email, please do send them my way and I will forward them on to the Zorbit's team.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Such a pleasure. Now go stretch your legs, move those muscles, warm up now.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.